Nazi.
We receive reports that Russian forces have reached an area just north of Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, as they continue their advance into the country. This is video from social media today appearing to show Russian armoured vehicles driving through the residential district of Obolon to the north of the city centre. That area is just 9 kilometres, that's 5.5 miles north of Kyiv's parliament, the presidential office and the city centre. Authorities, meanwhile, have told residents there in Obolon to stay off the streets as they say active hostilities are approaching.
So here we have a statement from the Party for Socialism and Liberation on the recent crisis, intervention, war, conflict, whatever you want to call it, in Ukraine. I want to read through it because I think they do a really good job summarizing most of the events that have transpired, as well as laying out what I believe should be the true left-wing position, or left, whatever you want to call it. My opinion, the correct position. You know, they do a really good job laying out what the correct position should be in all of this. So let's give it a quick read. The Russian military operation in Ukraine highlights that the world has reached a dangerous fork in the road. It is critically important for the people in the United States, who are receiving the bulk of their information from the capitalist media that functions as an echo chamber for the United States government, to know that the current crisis is the byproduct of a long-standing effort by the United States to establish absolute domination throughout Europe. The U.S. policy is aimed at undermining Russia's security by surrounding it with advanced missiles that can reach Russian targets in less than 10 minutes. So the United States has been building and installing missile sites around Russia inside of Europe. Kind of reminds you of like something popular in United States history, like a Cuban Missile Crisis, something like that, right? But what we have here is step one, the United States' aggressive expansion of NATO, of militarism, and surrounding Russia with military hardware. That's a threat. Let's continue reading. For the last 3 months, the Russian government simultaneously called for negotiations about their security concerns, while at the same time amassing troops at the Russian-Ukrainian border and at the border of Ukraine and Belarus. Putin announced that Russia would militarily intervene in Ukraine after the United States and NATO rejected their fundamental demands that Ukraine not be incorporated into NATO, and that Ukraine, which shares a 1,200-mile border with Russia, not be used as a staging ground for advanced missiles that target Russia. In essence, Putin and Russia were demanding that Ukraine be a neutral country and never a member of NATO. It was precisely through the territory of Ukraine that Russia was subjected to the Nazi invasion of World War II and earlier invasions by Western powers. In World War II, when Ukraine and Russia were one country, the Soviet Union, more than 27 million people died resisting the Nazi invasion of their homelands. So we're talking about modern context here. Expansion of NATO, specifically in reference to Ukraine, right? The building up of military arms along the Russian borders. The installation of American missiles. But also we have some historical context that through Ukraine was the thrust of the main Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And by the way, there was a history of collaboration of some of the locals, as there was throughout Europe, in that area. And their modern counterparts would be the Azov Battalion. So there's historical precedent also, too, for these Nazis in collaboration there. Mass graves, slaughters, all the horrors you hear about the Nazis in World War II. Those atrocities also took place in Ukraine, in the regions that we're focusing on, historically during World War II. Let's continue reading. At this critical moment, it is imperative that the U.S. government change its reckless, provocative stance of encircling Russia and relentlessly expanding NATO eastward. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States has attempted to incorporate almost every former Soviet Russian European ally into NATO, which is an offensive military alliance. So here in the West, we're billed as NATO being this defensive alliance, right? It's something to ensure a free and democratic Europe if Russian communists ever decided to roll 1 million tanks across the plains of Europe and invade. In reality, NATO is a tool of American imperialism. It's an offensive military alliance. They've taken plenty of offensive military actions in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East. Look at the American foreign wars, look at Libya, look at what happened in the Balkans in the 90s. But NATO is an imperial tool of the United States. It's there to keep Europe subservient to the United States. And one of the main strategies in which they do that is to continually saber rattle with Russia. And that makes sense because the driving force behind the creation of NATO was, aggression with the Soviet Union. So since the 90s, in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, we promised not to expand NATO eastward, and that's exactly what we've been doing. I'm going to continue reading here. After having all of its demands rejected by the United States and NATO, the Russian government decided to invade Ukraine. As of this moment, major military operations are underway. The Russian government said it will not occupy Ukraine, but that it intends to carry out the demilitarization and the denazification of the country. It is unclear what these terms actually mean. In some segments of the Ukrainian state, particularly the police and military, there is considerable Nazi influence. In the political life of Ukraine, the power of fascist groups has waned considerably in recent years, and they do not exercise decisive influence inside the administration of President Zelensky. Yes, but they are forced to, in a coalition, work with the neo-Nazis and the fascists. They incorporated the Azov Battalion into the National Guard officially. Zelensky is a puppet of the oligarchs and an economic tool for the United States. The Azov Battalion is a puppet of our deep state and a militaristic tool of the United States in order to antagonize Russia. Let's continue reading. The United States and European powers have vowed to impose a total sanctions regime of Russia, cutting the country off from the world economy and targeting its most vital industries. An initial volley of sanctions was announced by Biden today. These targets some of the largest banks and corporations in Russia and are especially aimed at limiting Russia's ability to access foreign currency and high-tech markets. A series of sanctions have already been imposed since 2014, with Russia's incorporation of Crimea after the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev. More measures are likely to follow. Taken together, the events of the last 2 days constitute a profound and historic rupture in the existing geopolitical order and will have cascading consequences for years to come. So, the reason why this is super important is because this is, beyond war, tragedy, death, destruction, all of these bad things, and the psychos who profit off of that. This is also super important because this is the first time that Russia or any country on the world stage has defied the imperialist United States in this kind of manner in a long time, in a very, very long time. And that's a huge geopolitical shift, because we've been the bully doing whatever we want for the past 40 years, especially for the, since post World War II. But, from the 90s through the 2000s, we just went around the planet blowing up anyone and everyone. So to see Russia standing up and willing to confront the Western powers militarily and willing to do intervention is a very big shift, for sure. Definitely, for sure. War is never a good thing, but it shows how we might not necessarily be going from a unipolar to a multipolar world, but at least a bipolar world as the Russian and Chinese bloc kind of grow closer and as the United States power continues to wane. Let's keep reading. A preventable tragedy. The deadly fighting currently raging across Ukraine is a tragedy. In any war, the working class of the nations involved are the ones to bear the brunt of the hardship and suffering. From 1922 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the peoples of Ukraine and Russia lived in peace. They were partners in a socialist planned economy, and together they defeated the fascist Nazi invasion of 1941 at the cost of 27 million Soviet lives. The bourgeois-led counter-revolution that dissolved the Soviet Union separated the peoples and republics. This animus and hostility that followed was the predictable outcome of the end of socialism and the beginning of capitalist competition. I would add to that it was a brutal fire sale, stripping, raping of the economy, the peoples, the natural resources, the planet that Russia currently inhabits, the part of the planet that is within Russian borders. It was a complete fire sale with the collapse of the Soviet Union, led by the West, led by the United States. People like to call Putin an oligarch and a warlord, we are the ones who put him in power. We are the ones who enabled him to do these fire sales and to create this oligarchy within Russia because it was to the benefit of a few people here. We have proof. I mean, we have Yeltsin talking to Bill Clinton, saying basically, hey, I'm going to grease some wheels and do some moving and shaking, and it's looking like Putin will be the one to replace me. And Bill Clinton's like, great. We see a lot of good things about Putin. This is great. Looking forward to your next call, Boris. Can't wait to see you again. So we created a massive fire sale. We put Putin into power. We created this oligarchical regime in Russia that we now want to call so evil and point at as if it's like some, horrible, what's the word I'm searching for? Like Frankenstein of capitalism, but it's not. It's not. It's not an aberration. It's what it was designed to be. So for years and years, Soviet Union, especially during those times, Ukrainians and Russian relative peace. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fire sale of the Western capitalists, animism and hostility has increased, especially in the more modern era as we dangle NATO membership and European Union membership to try and rile up the population in order to become unruly and less pro-Russian. So, the deadly fighting currently raging across Ukraine is a tragedy in any war. The working class, right? The bourgeois-led counter-revolution that dissolved the Soviet Union, separated people and republics. The animus and hostility that followed was the predictable outcome of the end of socialism, the beginning of capitalist competition. While we do not support the Russian invasion, we reserve our strongest condemnation for the United States government, which rejected Russia's legitimate security concerns in the region with total intransigence. It's a new word for me today. Boom. With total intransigence that they knew could provoke such a war. This is the consequence of decades of U.S. NATO bullying and humiliating Russia. The Party for Socialism and Liberation demands that the U.S. government and its allies in the imperialist NATO military alliance immediately cease their provocative behavior designed to escalate the crisis and provide security guarantees that can be the foundation for the restoration of peace, the cornerstone of which must be a pledge to end NATO expansion. This is what can bring relief to the people of Ukraine. The prevailing narrative of the mainstream media right now is Putin just decided to do this in a vacuum. He's a bad guy. He's evil. And, he woke up and just decided it's time to rebuild the Russian Empire. I am Tsar Vladimir. But reality, this is the obvious end result of saber rattling, encirclement, military expansionism, hallmark behaviors of a dying empire. The United States is a belligerent dying empire. We pushed Russia into this corner, and now this was the logical result that anyone who was paying attention, or all of the experts who are not deep state propagandists, told you what would happen if the United States continued to behave in its aggressive and imperialistic manner. Let's continue. A highly explosive situation has been developing in Eastern Europe, not only in recent weeks and months, but for many years. What happened last night and the terrible violence to come was preventable, but decisions made by NATO powers at every juncture since the end of the Cold War set the region on a collision course that was bound to come to a head sooner or later. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp of Eastern Europe, the imperialist NATO military alliance has steadily expanded eastward, absorbing 14 formerly socialist states between 1999 and 2020. 3 of these countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were former republics of the Soviet Union itself. In 2008, a war broke out between Russia and Western allied Georgia after Georgian forces attacked the pro-Russian breakaway region of South Ossetia. So this is very similar to what was happening in every other country in Eastern Europe for the past 25 to 30 years. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we have slowly but steadily kept absorbing more and more of these Eastern Bloc countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, into the European Union, into NATO, into economic agreements, into military agreements. We've basically made a shit ton of puppet and vassal states out of Eastern Europe, not because we care about the people of Eastern Europe and we want to bring them Pop-Tarts and fake tits and internet and capitalism and democracy and all that shit. It's because we are a belligerent empire and we want to use them by any means necessary to ensure our domination over Europe and to ensure a stranglehold over the Russian economy and Russian military. It's the same shit that's been going on, except the difference this time is Russia finally took a stand. Their war is illegal. It's bad. I don't like people dying. But this is the obvious move. If Russia doesn't do this, there is potential that they are no longer a sovereign nation in the near future. And that's a logical fear for Russian people to have, for the Russian government to have, considering not only modern history of the United States, but the history of the Western European powers and the American powers for the past 150 years. So let's read about the coup. In 2014, a coup started by the West took place in Ukraine that replaced the neutral government of Viktor Yanukovych with a staunchly anti-Russian government. This coup created the essential preconditions for the current crisis and war. It did not come out of nowhere in the last few months. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty, which were cornerstones of the arms control architecture of Europe. The mainstream media for years told you how Trump was a Putin puppet, blah, blah, blah. He was openly hostile in ways with Russia that were really concerning. One of them being him ripping up treaties for nuclear arms. So we've been expanding NATO. We've been ripping up arms control treaties that were mutually beneficial for Russia and America and beneficial for the world at large because it de-escalated tensions between the two nations. It lowered the amount of nuclear weapons that there are in the world. It prevented countries from developing small-scale nuclear weapons, which could lead to a slippery slope of eventually using full-scale tactical ICBMs that will destroy the entire world. So, yeah, we've been escalating with Russia. Actions elsewhere in the world compounded the tensions. In 2011, NATO carried out the destruction of Libya on the basis of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which Russia allowed to pass based on false assurances from the West that it would not be used to justify a regime change operation. Remember how they built NATO as a defensive alliance to protect Europe from Russia? From Soviet influence or whatever they want to fucking say? The reality of it is, when Gaddafi wants to create a African-based currency and sell his oil in that instead of the US dollar, NATO will go in and fucking blow him up and have rebels stick a saber up his ass. And then, around the same time, a civil war broke out in Syria, a close Russian ally. Russia intervened in Syria militarily to prevent US-backed reactionary fundamentalist forces from seizing control of the country. So after Libya collapsed, we created what they call a rat line. This is why there were so many CIA and deep state and intelligence operatives in Benghazi, was because they were taking the weapons of Libya and shipping them to literal terrorists and jihadists, ISIS, al-Nusra, fundamentalist Islamists who kill people. We were giving weapons to them in Syria to destabilize their government in order to bring Assad to the bargaining table so we can remove him from power and install someone who is more partial to our economics, especially in the realm of fossil fuels. Russia intervened and propped up the Syrian government and saved it. So NATO is blowing up Libya, a sovereign nation, because it wants to wage economic war. And then they're taking the weapons from there and allowing their U.S. leader, the leader of NATO is in reality the United States, allowing the United States to then ship all those weapons to literal fundamentalist ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the people who killed our own people on 9/11. We gave them weapons in Syria. And if you don't believe me, just ask John Kerry. He'll tell you ISIL was on our side. They were on our side. They were on the road to Damascus and they were pressuring Assad. That's why we sat back and did nothing. Do you really think the United States, with all of its assets and military hardware and drones and satellites, was shocked when a bunch of guys in brand new Toyotas rolled out of the desert and started stealing hardware? Where do you think they got the money for those Toyotas? Come on, guys. Come on. So the United States' recent history with Russia is, cucking them at the UN so we can do interventions, topple democratically elected, or not democratically elected, Gaddafi wasn't democratically elected, but, topple sovereign governments around the world. And then we're also attacking Russia's ally and arming terrorists to try and carry out our politics. So when Russia was involved in Syria, they were fighting ISIS while we were basically providing air support for ISIS. It's great, right? A turning point in world politics. The speech given by Vladimir Putin last night announcing the invasion made it clear that he was prepared for an intense and long-term confrontation with the West. Starting with the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, Putin listed a litany of aggressive actions by the West and called on all segments of Russian society, military and non-military, to do their part in the coming mobilization, which undoubtedly will involve profound economic turmoil inside of Russia. Putin's intentions appears to be to change the balance of forces in Europe and turn the geopolitical tide with a major military intervention. The plight of ethnic Russians, especially those in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, factored heavily into the speech delivered by Putin, which was directed towards the Russian public. Putin has been outspoken in recent days about his opposition to the Soviet policy on nationalities and considers the creation of a modern Ukraine to have been a grave error on the part of Vladimir Lenin. As the PSL pointed out in our February 22 statement. Let's quickly read through it. The policy promoted by Lenin was the cornerstone of maintaining peaceful relations and unity among the peoples of the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution until the beginning of the USSR's collapse. By organizing the new socialist state along the lines of the right to self-determination, Lenin was striking a blow at what was called Great Russian Chauvinism, the domination of the Russian state and the Russian nationality in the territory of the just overthrown Russian Empire. Along with the administrative transfer of territories, this was a way of ensuring that the people of the newly formed socialist state could live together in peace and equality, replacing the brutal domination characteristic of the Tsar's regime. The principle of self-determination laid the basis for multinational unity that was the foundation of the Soviet Union's great successes. For instance, 4.5 million Ukrainians fought alongside Russians to defeat fascism in World War II. There is no guarantee that Russia's effort to reverse the geopolitical situation in its favor will succeed. So far, the events of the past several days have allowed U.S. imperialism to secure key objectives. The critical Nord Stream 2 pipeline that would have brought massive amounts of Russian gas into the European market is no longer going forward. NATO troops have been and will continue to flood into Eastern European members of the alliance, including the Baltic countries that share a border with Russia. Just today, the Pentagon announced that it was sending 7,000 additional soldiers to Europe. Nord Stream 2 would have been a pipeline between Russia and Germany. The United States is the true power behind killing that agreement. We kill that agreement because, number one, it keeps Europe at odds with Russia. Number two, it makes Europe more dependent on us for fossil fuels, shipping our liquid nitrogen fracked gas across the ocean to them. Number three, it keeps Germany from getting too powerful and too independent from the United States. And four, it keeps the Europeans subservient to the United States and its empire. So yeah, let me continue. While Russia clearly aims to install a friendly government in power in Kiev, public support inside of Ukraine for the country's membership in NATO, which has never been completely dominant position, will undoubtedly surge in the aftermath of the invasion. The conflict currently exploding in Ukraine and rippling throughout the region and the entire world is hugely dangerous. The reckless and provocative actions of the U.S. government and its allies must cease immediately. The economic warfare being unleashed against Russia, which will first and foremost affect the country's working class, will only deepen the crisis, as would troop deployments anywhere in Europe. Recognizing that Russia has legitimate security concerns does not require an endorsement of its military actions, nor Putin's suggestion that Ukraine has no basis to exist as an independent country, nor his larger geopolitical strategies. The role of the U.S. anti-war movement is not to follow the line of countries in conflict with U.S. imperialism, but to present an independent program of peace and solidarity with anti-imperialism. The menace of war can only be defeated by international solidarity among the people of the world and a resolute struggle against U.S. imperialism. These last two paragraphs are important for me because the entire world lacks critical thinking skills. So if I criticize America, automatically people think I am for the other side. If I criticize Republicans, people think I'm a Democrat. If I criticize Democrats, people think I'm a Republican. No one has critical thinking, and everyone is tribal. So in this country, as soon as you say one thing, people jump to a conclusion. Me pointing out the imperialism of the United States, its culpability in this crisis, in the deaths that we're seeing, does not mean that I think Vladimir Putin's a great guy, that I'd vote for him, that I am pro-Russian intervention. What it means is I think Russia legit has security concerns. I think that the United States forced this issue. And I think, I'm not coming from the basis of U.S. is bad, therefore Russia good, therefore Ukraine bad. I'm coming from the basis of the war is bad, conflict is bad, the people set to profit off of this are bad, right? But we're not going to get there by every single time the corporate media tells you there's a bad guy, you all start posting, I stand with the poor people. Like, you guys fall for the propaganda every time they present a boogeyman. That's all I'm trying to say. And I think that this is a much more eloquent way of saying it. I'm going to repeat it just so it's clear, because it makes absolutely perfect sense. The conflict currently exploding in Ukraine and rippling throughout the region and the entire world is hugely dangerous. The reckless and provocative actions of the United States government and its allies must cease immediately. The economic warfare being unleashed against Russia, which will first and foremost affect the country's working class, will only deepen the crisis, as would troop deployments anywhere in Europe. Recognizing that Russia has legitimate security concerns does not require an endorsement of its military actions, nor Putin's suggestion that Ukraine has no basis to exist as an independent country, nor his larger geopolitical strategies. The role of the U.S. anti-war movement is not to follow the line of countries in conflict with U.S. imperialism, but to present an independent program of peace and solidarity and anti-imperialism. The menace of war can only be defeated by international solidarity among the peoples of the world and a resolute struggle against U.S. imperialism. I feel for people around the world, but if we're going to talk about boogeymen, if we're going to talk about bad guys, the biggest elephant in the room is the United States. We are the sole superpower. We are a vast empire with a tremendous military and a tremendous military budget. And we are willing to arm Nazis in order to antagonize our political enemies. We are willing to arm terrorists in order to antagonize our political enemies. Things aren't black and white, and we really need to understand and get rid of the idea that Putin is evil, mustache twirling villain from a cartoon, and he woke up on a random Wednesday or whatever and decided, today's the day I fuck Ukraine in the ass. Like, that's not what happened. It's not what happened at all. This was easily predictable. This was years in the making, decades in the making. And it's sad and it's tragic and it can be prevented. but we didn't prevent it. But, you know, we can prevent the next time something like this can happen if the United States public finally starts holding its imperialist government accountable. There's literally no anti-war movement in this country. There's more of an anti-war movement right now in Russia than there is in America. And meanwhile, we're still bombing half the world.